The government of the United States had its longest official shutdown between December 2018 and January 2019, thus reaching more than 34 days of a paralyzed government. The federal government of the US is the most important functioning body of the country and of the American economy. More than 1 million federal employees depend on the government of the United States. During the shutdown, the salary of more than 1 million federal employees were frozen until the White House and the Congress of the US had agreed to establish an annual budget for the operation of the expenses of the US government. And what was the cause of this dispute? The famous border wall that Donald Trump had envisioned. The president had initially asked for $5 billion to build the wall, but these $5 billion only represented 10% of the real estimated cost. The Democrats had refused to approve a budget that included this $5 billion to finance the wall, but at the same time, President Trump refused to let go of his campaign promise that helped him win the elections in 2016. His initial proposal that Mexico would pay for the wall never materialized, and Mexico never gave a single dollar. Even then, President Trump had continued to argue that Mexico would finance this wall, but until now, Mexico hasn't even proposed a single penny. The White House proposed that Mexico would pay for this wall with a new trade agreement between Canada, the US, and Mexico, but the US Treasury dismissed this entirely. Now 2 years after Trump's promise, there is still the absence of said wall, but Trump is already in control of the White House. He used this control to shut down the government, which had cost the country's economy more than his initial asking price. Today, we will see how the shutdown occurred, as well as the impact that it had on the politics and the economy of the United States. Let's begin. The United States of America is a presidential republic, where the president retains a lot of power, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and can order tactical nuclear attacks at any time. The president also designates the secretaries of the different federal departments, such as defense, security, justice, and others. But in the creation of the American Constitution, the founding fathers knew that it was critical that the United States Congress had enough power to enforce a proper functioning democracy. That is why in the US Constitution, only Congress, composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate, has the power to approve the federal budget of the United States. Unlike other types of laws, the general budget has to go through the approval of both the House of Representatives as well as the Senate in order to be validated, and then sent to the president to sign. If within the budget the House of Representatives and the Senate do not agree, or the President of the United States refuses to sign it for any reason, then the government and all its non-essential employees and federal agencies will close until it reaches an agreement and an approved budget. To date, there have been more than 20 government shutdowns, though the vast majority does not typically surpass 4 to 5 days while the Congress and the White House reach an agreement. Usually, these issues occur due to a political struggle between the Republican Congress and the Democratic White House, or vice versa. This last government shutdown was the worst of the country's history, which had led to an unprecedented economic, political, and social impact on the country. It is not uncommon for disagreements to arise between the executive and legislative power in any country. So why is it that specifically the United States government closes when the vast majority of countries cannot be shut down in a similar way? In other parts of the world, constitutions or political systems prevent scenarios that would be comparable to the impasse in which the US finds itself in. Although many parliaments also play a role on budgetary decisions, the difference is that most other countries have installed specific mechanisms in order to prevent such a situation so that the citizens do not pay for partisan disagreements. Usually, desperate situations aid in reaching a bipartisan consensus. But this last case was an exception, where a fictitious wall had been the cause of the longest shutdown in US history. Ironically, sometimes the situation is a little easier to handle when there is no elected government in some countries. Belgium, for example, was left without a government for 589 days between 2010 and 2011, but the money kept flowing. When the European coalition talks fail or takes too long, as was the case in Germany, the last approved budget is generally applied and administered by the previous government until a new leadership is assumed. In Australia, for example, budgets must be approved, or otherwise, the government is forced to resign or the parliament is dissolved. However, the difference in Australia as opposed to other countries is the threshold of legislators needed to confirm a government budget. An absolute majority, having more than 50% of all members of parliament already suffices. Therefore, the lack of budget approval generally only occurs when a government has lost the support of its own party or of the parties that support it. There are similar mechanisms in other countries influenced by the British parliamentary system and the style of the Westminster, including New Zealand, Bangladesh, and Canada. In those nations, budget votes can become votes of the de facto confidence in the government itself. In contrast, Republicans in the United States need 3/5 of Senate members to pass most laws, which means that they often require bipartisan support. This is to illustrate that the laws passed in the Senate are not just a matter of political position, but that they are laws that truly reflect the interest of the nation. Recently, Trump urged a reform of the Senate rules to be able to pass the government budget with a simple majority, but his proposal has been discarded since Republicans realized that this would mean the same would apply when Democrats win the majority again. The obsession that Trump has with realizing his wall and the resistance of the Democrats has caused a major impasse between Congress, whose lower house is controlled by Democrats, and the White House, controlled by Trump and the Republicans. Usually, Democrats and Republicans attempt to reach agreements quickly, not to prolong the suffering of federal employees. But in this case, Trump had overshadowed the entire Republican Party in a desperate attempt to fund his wall, at least so it seemed in the beginning. Trump had carried out a televised address to the nation where he indicated that the southern border is experiencing a humanitarian crisis, and he had expressed certain figures of crimes committed by undocumented immigrants within the United States. He had argued that without this border wall, the US would not be safe, and for that reason, Trump preferred to close down the government until the Democrats included the financing of the wall within the government budget. During a press conference between the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the Democratic Minority Leader in the Senate, along with President Trump, the Democratic leaders had announced that Trump was willing to close the government for months or even years if the wall was not approved. If the shutdown had lasted for months or more, it would have caused a recession that would slow down the US economy drastically. Wall Street does not like uncertainty, and having the federal government of one of the world's most important economy paralyzed does not help. Petitions are becoming more and more substantial for President Trump to end the trade war with China, which had already impeded the US economic growth. During the shutdown, we had seen new evidence that companies and consumers are losing faith in the global expansion. The president of the French banking group BNP announced that he sees a desalination of the US economy in 2019, but not a recession, although he suspected that a recession would be possible in the second half of 2020. But if the shutdown had continued, a recession could have hit by mid-2019. The last closure of the federal government directly affected the Department of Transportation, which includes airport staff, which had caused air traffic issues due to the lack of staff available. Another example of an affected department was NASA, where hundreds of scientific projects, such as the development of the James Webb Telescope, was paralyzed until the operations of the federal government reopened. Essential employees were still required to work, such as air traffic control operators, but their payments were withheld until the reopening of the government. The situation was more complicated for non-essential employees since they did not work. The government did not pay them back for lost time, so many did other activities or alternate jobs. Last year, the president was presented with 8 prototype wall models. The Department of Defense denied the concrete model of the wall, as it would not have allowed the US military to easily visualize what was found on the other side. So Trump had accepted that the final model would be made by steel. Little by little, Trump's initial idea of the Great Wall had been chipped away, first in design, and secondly, it will not cover the entire southern border since a large part of it belonged to private property and the expropriation of these territories would take years in court, a situation that would heavily impede the process of the wall's construction. Thirdly, the budget. If Congress was not even willing to spend $5 billion for the project, they would never release the $50 billion required for the original idea of the wall. Trump's famous promised wall had hardly been constructed after 2 years, and now with 2 years left in office, it is unlikely that it will ever be finished. His dedication to build his wall has harmed hundreds of thousands of federal employees and had caused the loss of more than $6 billion for the US economy. The paralysis of the federal government of the world's most important economy for a hypothetical fence had just worsened the situation for the US. Instead of solving issues, it just created more serious ones and had dragged the states to a constitutional crisis. Trump had threatened to declare a national emergency in order to use funds from the Department of Defense in order to complete this wall. After such a period of uncertainty and a partial reopening of the US government, Trump had finally complied with the resolution. Trump had announced that he would rededicate funds from the Department of Defense of about $6 to $7 billion that hadn't been used for the construction of military infrastructure to initiate the construction of the wall of the southern border. Trump had declared a national emergency, but the Democrats in the House of Representatives rejected his declaration, and surprisingly, even the US Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans. Up to 12 Republican senators joined the condemnation by the Democrats to reject the declaration of emergency. So with the entire Congress rejecting the declaration, Trump, with his presidential power, announced that he would veto the vote, which is within his rights as president, except if 2/3 of Congress revoked this veto, which would have been improbable. Even so, Trump's veto showed that the president could not convince all Republican senators that declaring a national emergency to build his wall was the best idea for the country. Although since February 15th the government had been reopened, the conflict between the White House and Congress seems far from over. Multiple states have announced that they will sue the president. With the volatility of US politics right now, it's truly hard to tell what will happen from now until the end of his term. But from this point on, time is ticking for President Trump to resolve the issues his administration has created. So I pass the question off to you. What did you think of the shutdown? Do you believe that the US government should adapt some type of mechanism to provide for the cessation of payment to non-essential employees? Or should they develop a system to avoid a shutdown altogether? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for new content every week.